What's up, duelists? It's your boy Keegan here, E3 Yu-Gi-Oh. You know me. You know what? You've been watching the channel. Most of the guys, you guys know what it is. If you don't know what it is, I mean, subscribe right now. Subscribe right now. I throw this event, the RBET event, every other month. It's the biggest Edison tournament online. If you don't already know about it, it's free to enter. You can join in the FL Discord in the description below, and that's where it's hosted. You submit a deck list day before the tournament. Pretty straightforward stuff. You get paired up, double elimination. You win money. You lose your time. But you know what? It's free entry. It's a good time. Come play Edison with everyone else. Anyway, that tournament's happening 1 p.m. Eastern time this Saturday and Sunday. Make sure you're there for that. Sign up start on Friday. Where was I going with this? Oh yeah, I'm doing predictions. I want to talk about what I think is going to do well in this weekend tournament. I think there's a lot of talk about a lot of different decks, but what's actually being played and what's actually being showcased having success is it's kind of interesting to look at. Let's just start off with the obvious ones. I think the three best decks going into this tournament are Blackwings, which I'm gonna signify with Sirocco, I suppose. Now that's a little telling. I'm gonna do Shura. Okay. And then Vayu, and then I think also Zombies, which I'm going to signify with Mizuki. Okay, these three decks, I think these are the three best decks moving into this weekend. Why do I think that these are the three best decks moving into this weekend? Well, Vayu has a lot of speed. It has the best ability to play around some other cards in the format. It has the best ability to play certain cards in the format. Same thing with Blackwings. And Zombies also have that kind of stuff. Mostly what it boils down to is that these decks can all play the cards Phoenix Wing Windblast, this card, and Regeki Break, and they can play them very effectively. That's the thing, is that these decks that can play these cards effectively, you have better removal than the rest of the format. You can interact in ways that's unfair compared to other stuff. When other people are stuck playing garbage cards like Bottomless Trap Hole, where you can only hit like certain monsters at certain points, they still get the effect, whatever. And you have Regeki Break, Phoenix Wing Windblast, which not only can hit monsters, but it can hit back row, it can play through Stardust, it can hit set monsters, it can do all of the stuff in any phase of the game. It can do it on your turn, on your opponent's turn. You don't have to respond to a summon. These cards are so insanely powerful, interactive-wise. And when you can support them using stuff like Vayu and Mizuki, then you know what? They're gonna dictate the shape of the game. Additionally, the Vayu and Blackwing decks can play this card, Deck Devastation Virus, to its fullest effect. I think these are the two best Deck Devastation Virus decks. So I think these are the clear three best decks moving into this weekend. I think they have the best matchups against the field. I think they do all right, as long as they're playing some combination of these cards. That being said, there are a few other decks I do want to talk about. I think that the Frog Hero deck is on a lot of people's radar, especially after the breakout tournament in RBET2, where it got second and third place, only losing out to Zombies in the finals. I think the Frog Hero deck is... Let me get Miracle Fusion up here. I think it's good. I think it's a very solid deck. I think it can also play Regeki Break and Phoenix Wing Windblast very effectively. It just has this issue where it suffers from its engines being very disjointed. The hero stuff doesn't really work well with the Monarch stuff, and the Frog stuff doesn't really work well with the hero stuff unless you find Miracle Fusion. So everything needs to be connected at certain points, whereas in the Vayu and the Blackwing and the Zombie deck, all the cards are inherently connected with each other. They have much more cohesive engines. All of your cards have synergies. Like Mizuki has synergy with Zombie Master. Zombie Master has synergy with Plague. That has synergy with Dark Arm, with Caius, with all that other stuff. All the engines play off each other. Whereas with the Frog Hero stuff, the weakness with these decks, even though it does have the strength of being able to play the most versatile interactive traps in the format, it does have the issue of having disjointed engine, that the Frogs are quite bad and the heroes are quite bad unless you specifically find Miracle Fusion for the heroes or the Monarchs for the Frogs. The games that you play where you lose with this deck is you're drawing the wrong half of your deck, and that just happens very frequently because the deck is forced to play 10 Frogs and it's forced to play at least 6 heroes. So you have 16 cards that don't work well with each other, and that's just the nature of it. I think it is a solid deck, though. I think it inherently has a very bad Zombie matchup. I don't think the matchup is good at all. I think the Zombie deck beats up on it, especially if they're moving more towards playing 3 Book of Life, which is another card that I think has just a lot of utility, making the zombie deck very powerful. It can be dead early on, of course, but if you're playing Raigeki, if you're playing Wind Blast, you know, and your opponent's setting up their graveyard with Values or with Treeborn Frogs, the Book of Life is going to be live ASAP, and it's just the best card. Another card I want to talk about, which is why I think the Blackwing decks and the Value decks are going to be the best decks moving into this tournament, is Royal Oppression. Those decks can play Royal Oppression, you know, to the fullest extent. They don't get hurt by it. You know, Shura activates in the damage step. Vayu doesn't banish for cost. So you don't get hurt by Royal Oppression, and you get to play it, which means no Battle Faders from the opponent, no Synchros from the opponent, no Cyber Dragons, no, you know, any sort of special summon stuff, and Royal Oppression really hurts the zombie deck quite a bit. Of course, Royal Oppression is awkward in a format where people are playing multiple Wind Blast, multiple Raigeki Break. It's like one of the worst cards to get Wind Blasted on top of your deck because you pay 800 life points, and then it goes to the top of the deck, and you're topping a card that negates special summoned, when presumably your opponent's already special summoned like their Synchro, and it's a terrible situation to be in. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. It is still obviously the best Floodgate in the format, bar none, not even close. But yeah. So all of this being said, looking at these I think are the top 4 or so decks. Let me see if there's anything else in my notes on this. Yeah, these are the top 4 decks I think moving into this tournament. If you have a good matchup against these 4 decks, then you have a very good chance at winning this tournament. That's what I'm basically going to say. If you're prepping and you can beat these 4 decks consistently, you have a solid plan for each of these, then you're going to be all right. I do want to talk about a few other decks that I think have a very good matchup against these 4 decks, basically. The first one is Fairies. I think Christia decks are going to be doing really well in this event. I think they're very well positioned to beat up on all 4 of these decks. The worst matchup for Fairies is probably the Frog Hero deck, but Vayu, Blackwing, and Zombies are all favored for the Fairy deck. The issue with Fairies, obviously, is it does reward you having a lot of practice. There's a lot of, you know, little decisions here and there that can add up to victories that you would normally lose out on. And it does reward someone who's been playing the deck for a fair bit of time. But that being said, Christia is broken, and Christia single-handedly beats these top 4 decks. So I think it is a great pick going into this weekend. I think you have a very good chance at taking the entire tournament, if not securing yourself a top, if you're going to be playing Fairies. Another deck that I think, you know, considering these as the top 5 decks, I suppose, that's going to do really well is Gravekeepers. I think Gravekeepers is very well positioned. It does phenomenally against both Vayu and Zombies. I think it's a bit of a toss-up versus the Frog Hero deck. It does shut off their Miracle Fusions, but you know what? You do lose a little bit to the Treeborn, Caius, and Ryza stuff. Royal Tribute's a broken card. Gravekeepers is a solid sort of anti-meta strategy against all of these. And Gravekeepers also has a near 100-0 matchup versus Fairies. I think it's very difficult for the Fairy deck to ever beat Gravekeepers, especially post-board. Gravekeepers does have the ability to play the Wind Blast or Raigeki Break if they truly want to. I think that they usually don't. I think they usually opt more towards playing stuff like Deck Dev, more stuff like Royal Oppression. They're playing more traditional traps. But you can theoretically support the discard using cards like Morphing Jar and Gravekeeper still. I'm going to go ahead and pull those 2 up. I just want to have everything I'm mentioning like to be on the screen at the end of this video. But yeah, I think given that you have cards like Gravekeeper Stell, Morphing Jar, that sort of stuff, you can fuel the discard traps pretty easily. Maybe play 2-3 copies of Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. It's not the worst thing you could do in your Gravekeeper's deck. It also doubles as spell and trap removal in a deck that normally doesn't want to play Heavy Storm. I know a lot of Gravekeeper players are onto Heavy Storm as technology, but I think it's not that common in the Gravekeeper deck in general. But this card can give you those extra spell and trap removals that you need in order to push for game. I think the Gravekeeper deck is pretty well positioned moving into this weekend as well. So I think these what is it, 6 decks? If you're playing one of these 6 decks, you can expect to do well as long as you're playing hot. I think that's a pretty safe assumption to make. Now I'm going to get into a few other decks that I think could cheese given like random circumstances, and then I'm going to get into a bunch of tech cards that I think are going to do really well into this metagame. So the first thing is I think there's been a serious decline in the use of Starlight Road. If you look at these decks up here, most of these decks don't play Starlight Road. The Frog Hero deck doesn't, the Zombie deck doesn't, the Shura Blackwings is the only deck up here that may or may not play one Starlight Road. Fairies doesn't. Gravekeepers does, to be fair, but it conflicts with their Royal Oppression. So oftentimes they're looking at playing something like Dark Bribe as well, because Dark Bribe's downside, which is that it lets your opponent draw a card, is often mitigated by the deck devastation viruses that you're maining inside of your Gravekeeper's deck. Gravekeepers is also hurt by deck devastation virus, which is something you have to keep in mind, but they play a relatively low monster count, so oftentimes it's just going to be a 2-for-2 with tempo, which is favorable in your side of things, more or less. And if you already have a monster in play with Necro Valley, then it's going to make your monster resilient to the deck devastation virus as well. Dark Bribe is usually what's being played in that, and I think because there's a drop-off in the use of Starlight Road, Heavy Storm gets a lot better. Decks that may or may not be playing it in the future, like Gravekeepers, you might want to play it straight up. There's a few other things that do get better. I think Torrential, Mirror Force, if your deck wasn't playing these, they do have a lot more value, I think. Lightning Vortex as well. Let me go ahead and pull that up before I forget about it. I think Lightning Vortex is actually getting a lot better. If you look at all of these decks, let's talk about like Vayu Sirocco, right? They go Greffer, that type of thing. Pitch, Special Summon Armedwing. They have a lot of monsters in play. Lightning Vortex is pretty good against that. If you can put together a way to like prevent you from dying, like a way to gain your life points a little bit or whatever, and then you can Vortex sweep their board, it's actually pretty solid. And these decks are, generally speaking, not playing Starlight Road just because it conflicts with the Royal Oppression that they're maining. So I think Lightning Vortex has a lot of value moving into this weekend. It's also very good against, I think, the zombie decks. If they go for a half push, it's great against the frog decks because the frog decks are often trying to set up multiple dupe frogs and like a Miracle Fusion, like Absolute Zero guy at the same time, set up those cards and have a board of like 3 to 4 monsters. Lightning Vortex is pretty good there. So I think Lightning Vortex going into this weekend is a very good tech card that you can use in your deck. I think it works well in a lot of other decks. There's one other deck I want to talk about that I think has the potential to just spike a tournament randomly, which of course is Lightsworn. What are we going to use? What are we going to use to signify the Lightsworn deck? Let's just do Judgment Dragon. That's a good one. Okay, yeah. I think Lightsworn obviously has the potential to do well. It did very well in RBET 2. I just think that Lightsworn also, like, if you look at it up against all of these decks, Lightsworn does pretty terribly against the zombie deck. It does pretty terribly against Blackwings. Back in the day, like when Blackwings first came out, people were like, it's the Lightsworn killer. And it was. Like, it just murders Lightsworn decks. It's a very bad matchup, I think, for Lightsworn. And then I also don't think Lightsworn does well against Gravekeepers or Christia decks either. I think it just struggles there. I think the best matchup it probably has is against Frog Hero. But that being said, I mean, charge, recharge, turn 1 is insane. You could just run hot. So if you're looking to gamble, I think Lightsworn is one of the best decks to gamble with. Okay, what else? Okay, let's talk about some of the like tier 2 options, some of the stuff that I think has potential to do okay if you're able to fade a few things. I think that moving into this weekend, Dragons, while they, in theory, crush a lot of these decks thanks to Drago, the problem is Drago into these discard traps is really mediocre. Drago doesn't do enough to answer a resolved Armedwing. It doesn't do enough to help you fight through like multiple trap cards. It gets attacked over by Sirocco. It gets run over by Kalut. It is really good when it does stick. And it can obviously stick and completely murder the zombie deck, the Vayu decks, and it can do really well against the Fairy deck and Lightsworn deck as well if it sticks. But it's just not reliable enough. Unless you're playing, which is some of the tech cards I'll get into later, I think the Dragon deck is going to struggle a little bit to try and compete with decks that are maining multiple copies of Regeki Break and Phoenix Wing Windblast. These specifically, these 2 trap cards, rip apart the standard Dragon decks. Even the combo-oriented Dragon decks, they get murdered by Windblast and Regeki Break. Like, you'll go for a push, they'll drop Trag, you just Windblast the Trag and kill them on the next turn. It's, like, very difficult for the Dragon decks to deal with these types of cards, as well as Deck Devastation Virus. That actually hurts the combo Dragon decks significantly. If they're the Dark combo decks, it hits the Phantom of Chaos, and if it's the Debris Dragon Instant Fusion combo decks, it hits the Debris Dragon, obviously, and it makes it just very difficult for that deck to ever really get going. I think Quickdraw decks are another deck that they are, always like a stable option, but unfortunately stable isn't really going to cut it into decks playing, Royal Oppression. Windblast Regeki Break is a great way to break up the Drill Warrior but Drill Warrior Dandy Loop. The zombie deck with Book of Life has very good time keeping you off Pot of Avarices, keeping your Dandelion banished. I think it's a very bad matchup. The Frog decks, they Ryza Windblast you to death. If you set a Raikou, you set a Hamster, you're just a little too slow into those decks. I think the Quickdraw deck does do okay against Fairies, but it gets absolutely murdered by Gravekeepers. I think it's a terrible matchup for Quickdraw. So, yeah, it's going to be a tough weekend for Quickdraw. If my predictions are correct, I think the Lightsworn deck, Quickdraw deck, it's a 50-50 matchup. It can be tricky depending on the draws, but the Quickdraw deck can put some stuff together. Drill Warrior's pretty good against the Lightsworn deck, and so is Battle Fader. And I think the Quickdraw decks are pretty good at playing Battle Fader. That's another card that I've been kind of on the fence about. I think it's very good, but it's also very bad because the value decks can just flip Oppression to stop it. Like it's very good in the situations where it's good, because it's a hand trap, right? Hand traps are very good, but Royal Oppression, that's a tough one. And deck dev as well. Deck dev in the post-board games, it gets even worse. You get the idea. You get the idea. It's pretty good against zombies, though, I will say. Battle Fader, pretty good against zombies. Okay, some of the other tech cards I expect to do well this weekend are... I expect to see a lot of Trap Stun. I expect to see a lot of 7 Tools. Let me rearrange this a little bit. I think we'll put these up here, because I think these 2 cards are actually going to do very well. And I think these cards, I'm going to put the Vortex up here, because these are cards I expect to do well. These are things that I expect to do not so well down here. Or the Dark Bribe was just in correlation with the Royal Tribute deck. I'm going to remove some of these, but yeah, you get the idea. You get the idea. We'll get the Heavy Storm out of here too. These are the cards I expect to do well. These are the decks I expect to be the decks to beat and the cards to deal with. Naturally, Trap Stun 7 Tools deals with Regeki Break, Wind Blast, deck dev very effectively. 7 Tools a little awkward against a Resolve Depression, but Trap Stun also pretty great there as well. So I think Trap Stun and 7 Tools are looking like excellent tech picks moving into this weekend. I think main deck Dust Tornado might be, just popping. It's a super great way to deal with some of these interrupts. The issue is that these cards can fuck with your shit, more or less, and Dust Tornado can only fuck with half of their stuff. So if your deck can't support Regeki Break and Wind Blast, but it can support Dust Tornado, I mean, it's still okay. It's still, like, kind of the next best thing you can do. But the issue is, like, Regeki Break and Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, they just do it better because they can also hit monsters. Of course, the versatility is everything. If your deck can't support the versatility of these 2 cards, Dust Tornado is probably one of the next best things, but yeah, I expect to see a lot of it mained. Okay, what else? There's a couple other decks that I think won't do that hot. I think the X-Saber deck is going to struggle. It's going to struggle because look at these cards, right? These cards just destroy the X-Saber deck. I don't think there's anything they can really do to play into these without maxing Trap Stun 7 Tools, that kind of stuff. And these cards are awkward, right? Because X-Sabers, they want to resolve Gotham Z-Call. But if you have to Trap Stun late on the chain, like Gotham Z-Call, it's not going to work. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no way you can play into a face-up oppression with Trap Stun and Gotham Z-Call. It just doesn't work. There's no way you can figure that out in a chain situation. So I think it's awkward. You don't get to play the best outs to these trap cards, but you also lose to all of these trap cards. So it's just kind of an awkward situation for sure. 7 Tools not too bad in the X-Saber deck, but 1-for-1 trades with specifically trap cards not the best. Okay, what else am I talking about here? Okay, another deck, Ancient Gear. I think Ancient Gear, it was really hot that one weekend, and I think it does have some really interesting, like, cool effects. Like, Ancient Gear Beast is really good against the Vayu deck. Like, actually really, really good against the Vayu deck. And it's very good against the Zombie deck, too. I think the Ancient Gear Beast is a solid card. And then I also think Machina Fortress is a really good card, too. So, like, the Machina decks, the Machina Gadget decks, let me talk about those a little bit, too. I'm just kind of, like, stream of consciousnessing this whole thing. We're going to figure it out together. You know? You and I, the audience. Make sure and leave a comment. Make sure and subscribe if you've made it this far into the video. I want to hit 5K by June. That'd be really sick. But yeah, okay. Where was I? Yeah, the Ancient Gear decks. Ancient Gear decks, I think they do all right against the Zombie and the Vayu decks. I just think they struggle a little bit getting that last few points of damage in. So, that being the case, that on top of everyone side decking Cyber Dragon and having just like a really good post-board configuration against you, it becomes tough for these decks. I think it's mostly the Chimera Tech, because Chimera Tech is such an easy inclusion into anybody's deck. It makes these machine decks very difficult to play. Yes, you can use Zombie World as a terraforming target to turn off the Cyber Dragon, but if you activate Zombie World against the Zombie deck, you're kind of buffing their deck significantly. So I think it's a little bit awkward. I think it's not so great against the discard traps as well. Part of the strength of Ancient Gear Beast and the Ancient Gear monsters is that they can attack into Deep Prison and Mirror Force so effectively. When everyone's playing Wind Blast and Regeki Break and not playing Deep Prison or Mirror Force, these cards get a lot worse. Machina Fortress, it's good when your opponent is trying to Caius it, trying to Rise it, but if they put it back on top of the deck, like, you're trading 2 for 2 and then you're redrawing a tribute monster the next turn. If you don't have another machine, then it's not a good look. It's not a good look. So I think the Ancient Gear deck, it's going to have to do some configuration in order to play into these back row, which really crush it. and then also deal with the Chimera Tech stuff in the post board. I think that makes it a little bit of a tricky sort of deck to play into the field, I think. I think it also does pretty poorly against Fairies. Despite the Ancient Gearbeast strength, I think that Honest is too good, Freed is too good, and Christia is lights out, as well as Oppression is also lights out. So I think these decks are going to struggle quite a bit. The Gadget deck probably going to struggle a little bit less. However, the deck does just fucking lose to Deck Devastation Virus immediately. So, it's tough. It's tough to say whether or not this deck will do anything. It hasn't done anything in the past. I don't expect that to change anytime soon. There are a few other decks. There are a couple like rogue decks that I think are pretty sweet, pretty interesting. I think one of the rogue decks going into this weekend that could really make some waves is Chainburn. I think Chainburn is going to do really well. We'll use Chain Strike to signify this. You do have to practice with this deck. This is not one of those decks you can just pick up. I think if you have it in your arsenal, if you have the ability to play it, maybe this weekend is the weekend to play it. I think it can do really well this weekend. Yes, of course, I know people are going to be playing Trapstun. Yes, I know people are going to be playing 7 Tools. Still think Chainburn's going to be great. Chainburn does really well against all these decks up here. The only deck it doesn't do very well against, I think, is Lightsworn. Lightsworn is a pretty tough matchup, but I think all the other ones it's going to do pretty well against. Against Frog Hero, you don't really care. You just ignore their strategy and you kill them with the Chain D-Wall, that kind of stuff. All the burn cards do really well there. Against the Vayu Blackwing decks, you do have to be careful about Icarus attack in the end phase. There is a Blackwing deck circulating right now that I know a couple people are playing. I did a list, or I did a video on a list with 3 Phoenix Wing Windblast and 3 Icarus attack, and what people did is they just took it a step further. They're now playing 3 Phoenix Wing Windblast, 3 Icarus attack, and some number of Regeki Break. I believe it's like 2 or 3 Regeki Break on top of that. And they're playing the Royal Oppressions. The trap lineup is just like so versatile. They can pop anything in the M phase. So it's a little bit tough for, I think, the Chamber deck to deal with that specific Blackwing list. By the way, I think that Blackwing list is disgusting. I think that that's probably the best deck in the format. Like, I don't really understand how anything can ever beat that. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to play against it. Like, even if you're playing Royal Decree, which is another card I want to talk about, along the same vein of these like Trapstun, 7 Tools of the Bandit cards, like, even if you're playing Royal Decree, the deck can put up so much damage so quickly thanks to, like, you know, fucking Kalut and Shura and Sirocco and the Whirlwind Searches. And if you don't have Royal Decree, you're not stopping their very aggressive proactive game plan. So you have to have, like, Royal Decree with, like, multiple books, and it's just, like, you're asking too much at that point. You're asking too much to be able to stop it. Their strategy is just too proactive. And Royal Decree has to be down before their discard traps are down, because then they just chain a discard trap to it or chain an Icarus attack to it. So it's very easy for them to out this card if it's not down on the first turn of the game and you're going first. That's the issue with it, I think. Where else was I going with this? I think that's something you need to consider. Where was I was talking about something. I lost it. Oh, Icarus attack. Yeah, Icarus attack against Chainburn. Icarus attack can make the Chainburn matchup pretty miserable. I think it's very difficult, but you know what? Hey, another card that I think is going to be pretty deck that plays a certain card that I think is going to be pretty good moving into this weekend is the Doomcaliber deck I played recently. It was like Doomcaliber, Glads with D-Fissure. I think that D-Fissure is really good. D-Fissure does something that some of these other floodgates don't do, is that it demands the response of one of these on the chain. Otherwise, you're guaranteedly turning this into a 2-for-1 later on. A 2-for-1 in your favor. D-Fissure makes it so that these discard traps, all their discard, synergies when they're discarding a Vayu or a Malicious or something to that nature, it's getting banished. It's not getting them the value that they would normally like using this, and this significantly weakens these 2 cards. It's also pretty interesting in that, like, it's good even on, like, open board states. It helps makes your monsters, like, a lot better. It, like, forces Rykos to target it. If you have Doomcaliber Knight, it's, like, just one of those really awkward cards to deal with. I think the Doomcaliber D-Fissure gadgets deck, or not gadgets, Glad's deck, I think that's a very, very powerful deck into the top 3 decks specifically. Actually, the top 4 decks in general. I think you could actually make an argument that it's great against all of the top 7 decks I even named. This might be the deck to play this weekend, actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, this might be a really good deck. I did a video with it recently. You can go check it out. It was playing 3 Doomcaliber Knight, a couple copies of the Kawakimaru Guardian as well. This is just a way to make sure your defissure sticks through Raikou. And then if the defissure sticks, all of these decks doing unfair graveyard shit just lose immediately. They have no play against this. It's very difficult for them to out this without spending multiple cards. And then from there, you can pick them apart quite easily with your Gladiator B strategy. What else do I have in my notes? I have some other stuff in my notes. Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. Along the same lines as defissure, I think this card's going to do great. I think it's a really, really underrated card. It has the double crow when it connects, and then it also has the built-in one-sided Imperial Iron Wall. Both effects, amazing. It's a dark, amazing. It's a spellcaster, actually amazing. Decks can play this, Blackwings can play this. They can make Arcanite off of it using Gale, which is kind of cool. I think this deck, or this card is going to do really well in a lot of different strategies. You can play it in Fairy, you can play it in Gravekeeper, you can play it, well, one of the strengths in Gravekeeper in the past was you could play it alongside Rivalry, but I think Rivalry's gotten a lot worse, obviously, in the face of these and in the face of the recent nerf. You can play it in Lightsworn, which is not bad. It's a dark for your Chaos Sorcerer, for your Dark Arm, that sort of thing. Twilight Sworn, I guess. And just being a spellcaster is actually not bad. It helps you make Arcanite, helps you make Tempest Magician, which is another card that can help burn out opponents when they get low. Where else am I going with this? What else we got? Oh, DD Crow. DD Crow, I don't know how good DD Crow is going to be moving into this weekend. I think more people are opting to play the more wide sweeping, like defissure, Kaiku, Soul Release type effects. I think DD Crow is only really good if it has some sort of utility outside of it banishing one monster. I.e., you're playing Allure, you're playing Icarus Attack, you're playing Pot of Avarice, you're playing Drill Warrior. Ways to make this being a monster relevant. Otherwise, I think Soul Release and Kaiku have kind of overtaken it as like the banish stuff of choice card. It does do really well against the Norlaris deck going first because you can prevent them from Norlarising on the first turn of the game. But if you're playing one of the best decks, most of these decks don't mind getting hit by Norlaris because it's like, oh, thanks, you discarded my Vayu stuff. Oh, thanks, you discarded my Mizuki stuff. You know, oh, thanks, you discarded my Treeborn Frog and I topped the Monarch. I'm winning this game all of a sudden. So I think DD Crow, I think it's going to fall out of favor a little bit. I think some of the stall cards are okay. I think the level limit, area B type effects are going to be pretty okay. Messenger of Peace is another card that I think is a very interesting one moving into this weekend. Messenger of Peace and level limit area B, they kind of demand a response. You can sort of overtax these discard cards by putting up something like a Kaiku and then also putting up like a fucking one of these, maybe not Kaiku specifically, but you can put up like a Secutor, you could put up one of these as well and like go off from there or something. I'm not really sure exactly what you would combo with these. An X-Saber monster maybe that demands an out and then play a Messenger of Peace or a level limit area B and that also demands an out and then you overtax the discard traps basically. If your opponent has 2 discard traps but they only have one thing they want to discard, you can get some favorable 2-for-1s by playing these sort of proactive floodgates that also have effects when they activate as well. I think that's something we might expect to see a little bit more moving into this weekend. And then we might expect to see a little bit more Grand Mole. I know that this is a tech I've been using a lot in a lot of my sideboards lately. I'm kind of on the fence about it. If your deck plays Sagan, you can search it really easily. If your deck has, you know, a pretty good defense game, like if you're playing Battle Faders and whatnot, or if you're playing a monster that locks out special summons, similar to Archlord Christia, then Grand Mole gets very good. Also, Grand Mole helps if your deck is struggling dealing with stuff like Hamster. I think the Blackwing deck has a little bit of trouble attacking into Hamster. Same thing with the Vayu deck. What else? We'll probably see a little bit less Noblemen. I think the set monsters are going to be a little bit more safe. That's why I think Gravekeepers and Fairies are also going to be very good because you can set your monsters pretty safely. Nobleman, it's one of those cards where it's like, it's good when it's good, but it's a total blank when it's not. And I don't know. I think people are valuing the versatility of outs more and more. And if you look at the decks that have consistently done well in Edison format, in these big tournaments, it is the decks playing the most versatile outs. You saw it all the way back with Topher 702 playing, you know, triple Icarus Attack in his Blackwings, playing compulsory over something like Bottomless Trap Hole in the main, playing Chaos Sorcerer, Thunder King, proactive, versatile outs. And then you see it all the way up until RBET2 with, you know, Cameron and Ralnuk top 2 and top 3 place with Windblast, Xeris topping with Lightning Vortex and Windblast as well. The more versatile outs are succeeding more consistently, more effectively. You can out the cards that give you the most trouble more effectively. And as a result, you're getting this sort of metagame where, I don't know, it's really warped around these two cards, I'd say. If your deck can play them, you should play them. If your deck can't play them, you should figure out how to play around them. And that's really my biggest prediction for this weekend. I think there are a few interesting cards that you could maybe tech to sort of deal with them a little bit more effectively that I might mention, might not mention. Obviously, the way to trade with the trap cards is a solid way to play the game. I don't think it's as consistent as just, having a good way to play into back row. Like, I think the zombie deck does a very good job of playing into back row. Like, if I summon a goblin zombie and I'm just poking you with it, and you Regeki break it, I get a search. You're down 2 for 0, and then all of a sudden my Book of Life is also live. So I think the zombie deck plays really well into these two cards. It can also very easily shuffle away cards so that you're not draw locked into the Wind Blast. What else is there? I think these are the best decks. I think this is what you should expect this weekend. I think if you're trying to attack the metagame from a new perspective, there is a lot you could do. There's a lot you could do to make sure that you can deal with all of this stuff. I think it is very possible to approach this and come up with something entirely new that just wins. There are certain cards that I think are a little bit slept on. Like, for example, Cyber Phoenix. This is a card that I was thinking about today in Ancient Gear, where it just, if your opponent targets your guy with a spell or trap, it negates it. This card's amazing in this metagame. You side this in, all of a sudden Regeki Break Wind Blast is terrible. They're not bringing in deck depth, so it's not getting hit by that. It's got a solid effect. If it's destroyed by battle, you get to draw a card, so there's just nothing wrong with that. You can protect this using your own battle traps, get some value out of it that way. It helps you swing your, Machina Fortress into D-Prisons, that sort of thing. I think this card is slept on. There's a lot of little cards like this in the format that do really well into this metagame that I think people could figure out lists around if they just took a little bit of time to sort of lab it over the next few days, or if they have already been working on something like that. These are just my generic catch-all predictions, and I think that we are more likely than not going to see something completely outside of this bubble do very well. That's also been the case in Edison format in the past. It's that someone somewhere comes up with things. Usually that someone's name is Carpath. And, no, I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. Carpath's a fucking insane deck brewer. But they come up with something that just approaches the metagame from a totally different angle, and it makes people look silly for playing the expected best stuff. That being said, you know what? You got to be able to beat some of the toughest cards in the format in order to do well. Good luck to everyone who's competing this weekend. I hope that you've figured out your deck list by now. I hope that you're just in the final stages of testing. I hope to see everyone who's watching this video join that event. It's going to be so much fun. I love streaming these events. It's going to be a blast. I'm going to have some fun people on commentary. It's going to be just a really cool experience. Edison format's great. It's really cool because you can have something like this. You can have a defined, what you need to beat moving into a tournament, and you can find the answers. You can find the Cyber Phoenixes. You can find the Obelisk, the Tormentors. You can find the cards that do really well against whatever is popular, and you can break a metagame wide open very easily. The card pool is very deep. The card pool is very balanced, and you know what? I think it's going to be a great time. Smash like, subscribe if you like this kind of thing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.